where do I even start?
I don't know.
This is an amazing panel. Well, so I'm going to start, I'm just going to start my left to right, turning this way, audience left to right as well. So let's start with this. When you started, what was hot? What did you work on? And what did you see as the future? And we're talking about when you started in technology, not when you were 2 years old. So let's start with Vint on that question.
Wow. Okay. So, well, I mean, by the time I'm 10 years old, I'm doing chemistry stuff because the Gilbert chemistry sets in 1953 had the most amazing chemicals in them. You know, like potassium permanganate, which is hypergolic with glycerin and stuff like that. You can't get any of that stuff anymore. But the serious technology work starts for me at UCLA with the ARPANET project, which I sort of accidentally fell into. It's not something that I initiated. I just got the wonderful opportunity to work on it with my colleague Steve Crocker in Len Kleinrock's office, along with John Postel and others. So for me, that was the biggest opportunity to see how you could put computers to work across a, literally, well, certainly a national scale network. There's something utterly beguiling about the possibility of having something, you know, doing something locally, in this case in Los Angeles, and having something happen 3,000 miles away.
Right.
I mean, that's just cool. And so we were all very much focused on what we could do with networks of computers that communicated, especially computers of different brands with different operating systems. You know, the heterogeneity was a very essential part of the exploration.
Interesting. Interesting. Can everyone hear Vint or not? No. Okay. Can we make sure that we hear Vint? Okay. It looks like the microphone fell down into his shirt somewhere. Okay.
It's your fault. You messed around with this damn thing. How many engineers does it take? All right. So now I have to do this all over again. I'm sorry about that.
All right.
Now I
Vint,
get
the
to get
question is, when you started, why don't you summarize in 30 seconds what you just said, just so the audience can hear you?
All right, so the short story is that I got to work on the ARPANET by accident at UCLA with Steve Crocker, John Postel, and Len Kleinrock. And we were completely beguiled by the idea that you could take a computer in Los Angeles and you could make something happen 3,000 miles away. And that really drove us to try all kinds of applications in this heterogeneous environment. And eventually it led to the exploration of the internet a few years later.
Wonderful. Okay. So, Ann, it's 1976, give or take. Technology at that time is something different than it is today. What are you thinking at that time? What are the big problems to solve? And where do you think the future is going to go at that moment in time?
Well, I'm not a scientist like the two renowned gentlemen beside me. I'm just a girl from a small town who learned how to code. And I had my first job at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis as a systems programmer working on operating systems. And I hated that job. So I decided to quit my job and start a company. It was not hot to start a company at that point in time. And my company was called Open Systems. We actually gave our source code away. I trademarked the name Open Systems and lost the trademark to Xerox about 5 years later. But you know, what was happening at that time was the personal computing sector was starting to appear, and we see technology come in these waves. I mean, for a venture capitalist, you know, we have a great job. We audition the future every day, and we tend to make our investments about 5 years before you see any of the companies and 10 years before they become real. So, you know, today we have a lot of bets in the water. Steve Jervison talked about some of them earlier. But we've already placed the bets for the next decade. So the question is what happens after that? And it's pretty much a golden age for software right now. To be a software company in 1976 was really being a very strange animal.
Wow. That was gutsy, especially the quitting your job part.
That's what my father said too.
Well, actually, I have a statistic on that because I started my first company in '74. In 1974, the total amount of high-tech venture capital in the United States was $10 million.
Really?
Wow.
That's 10 million?
I had no idea.
10 to the 6th?
To them, yeah.
Wow.
Well, that's great. That's a great entree to your turn. So here it is, 74. You're kind of entering the tech space. What are you doing at that time? What is the tech that you're working on at that time? What are the problems you're trying to solve? And how do you see the future? Because you became a futurist. Were you really a futurist in '74?
I was always interested in pattern recognition. I had a thesis on how the brain worked as a hierarchical system of recognizing patterns. And so I went after an unsolved classical problem, omni-font character recognition. Had a technique that could recognize printed letters in any type style, broken letters, touching letters, proportional spacing. It's kind of a solution in search of a problem. We did some market research, but key moment was I happened to sit next to this guy on a plane, and he was blind, and he was saying, well, blindness is not a handicap. I go around the world and represent my company and do deals, and I said, well, there is one handicap, which is I can't read ordinary printed material. Almost nothing is put in Braille or recorded form, and I have to get a reader, and there's loss of privacy. If I could read ordinary printed material, then there really would be no handicap in being blind. So that was the inspiration. We had to then invent the flatbed scanner and text-to-speech synthesis. So 1976, in fact, I remember the date, January 13th, we announced it. I remember that because that was the first time that Walter Cronkite did not deliver his signature sign-off himself. He had the reading machine read it, and that's the way it was, January 13th, 1976.
Wow.
Cool.
So a few years later, 1981, I realized that the key to being successful as an inventor was timing. Inventors whose names you recognize, like Thomas Edison or my new boss, Larry Page, my first boss, actually. We're in the right place with the right idea at the right time. So I started to study technology trends. I started with the common wisdom that you cannot predict the future. But I thought, being an engineer, if I gathered a lot of data, used the right visualization tools, squinted at the visualizations, maybe I could make some educated guesses. And I made a very surprising discovery, which has been the main thesis of my futurism, which is there's one thing about the future that's amazingly predictable, which is the price, performance, and capacity of every information technology follows a very predictable path. And that predictable path is exponential and not linear. So that's how I got into that.
Okay. OCR at the time you really came up with, I mean, today OCR is just taken for granted. It's one of those technologies that we invested in, we participated in, like the internet, like many of the companies you invested in, they're now taken for granted. And so how do you feel about that? Is that like, wow, I feel like I did something? Or, I mean, after you did OCR, you kind of went on and you worked on keyboards and music, which is kind of unrelated, but very important as it turns out.
Yeah, well, we also discovered the commercial application. So we had a commercial data entry system with our flatbed scanner and the OCR. So the early databases like Lexis and Nexus and many of the databases that ended up on the internet that you invented were scanned on the Kurzweil data entry machine. So that was gratifying, but I'm always worried about the next invention, the next payroll, and so I don't really think too much about the past. I'm focused on the future.
Fantastic. This is not on my question list, but it just dawns on me because do you ever wake up, Vint, and go, I invented the internet? I mean, just like for a second, it's like, it doesn't dawn on you, it's the freaking internet? Just for a second, I mean, you know.
No, no. And there's a good reason for this. Those of you who have children will understand something about this. You know, you don't want to take too much credit when your kids do well, because if they screw up, you don't want to take up too much blame, okay? So the way I would put it, I had a lot of help. Lots of people put their fingers in this pie. The one lesson that I have taught all of my engineers is that unless you learn how to sell your ideas, you're not going to do anything big. And so learn how to articulate your ideas, get other people to want to do what you want to do. And I spent a lot of my time doing that to fairly good effect.
Fantastic. You know, today, certainly in Silicon Valley, starting to be around the world, AI has become the big buzzword. Now, we could have probably said that on and off at times for 50 or 60 years. But there was this kind of nuclear winter of AI where mostly nothing happened for a very long period of time. And then over the last few years, there have been enough breakthroughs.
You do understand that back in the 60s,
I do.
the definition of AI was that it didn't work. And if it worked, it was engineering. You know, AI, I should be fair. If it didn't work reliably, it was AI. And I remember when at Stanford, we thought we could do language translation. So we put this Russian-English dictionary into the computer, and then we typed it. Out of sight, out of mind. And it was translated into Russian and translated back, and it came back, invisible idiot.
That's pretty good.
And that's when we knew that there was more work
I mean,
to
the
this
definition of AI is still the list of problems that have not yet been solved.
Fair. But it's become the big buzzword, and there have been some reasonable breakthroughs finally over the last few years that are encouraging. Certainly have encouraged easily hundreds of companies to be funded. Many may not succeed. So let's start with Vint. You know, what do you think about that, and how do you see this rolling out? Have we really seen enough breakthrough that this is going to impact enough industries, or not really? What are your thoughts?
Well, look, it's pretty clear that the biggest breakthrough in recent time has been multi-layer neural networks. Mm-hmm. The early work on perceptrons at MIT were trashed because it was a single layer system and couldn't detect connectivity, for example. And so that got discarded as a tactic. The breakthrough was building hundreds of layers worth of neural network with different kinds of convolutional interconnects. But I want to ask Anne what she's seeing in the marketplace right now of businesses trying to get started. The neural network mechanisms, although they are extraordinarily facile and can be applied to a lot of different things, they're still kind of narrow in terms of what you can train them to do. It's not like general artificial intelligence. So what are you seeing?
Well, and they need very large training databases, which is part of the problem.
But still, the tasks to which we put these to work are still, in my view, fairly narrow. Even Go, as impressive as the AlphaGo program is a fairly narrow application. So, Anne, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, probably about 5 years ago, we started seeing companies pitching to us, and other venture capitalists did as well, where they really had harnessed big data already, because that's yesterday's news. A lot of data out there, open APIs, and also a lot of open source sharing of basic machine learning technology from the likes of Google, Facebook, and others. So these narrow things are not meaningless. So the application in sales productivity, in marketing automation, in, of course, Google, in ad tech.
Right.
They're not solving the generalized problem, but they're having a big impact already, and they have had for the last 5 years, on all these subsectors, as you would call them. So do we have a generalized AI platform or neural learning platform that everybody is using right now? No. So that's your question, is when are we going to get there?
Well, let me give you some historical reflection. So I actually went to visit Frank Rosenblatt, who created the perceptron in 1962. I was 14. And he was making these fantastic claims, which was creating a lot of resentment in the symbolic school, like Marvin Minsky, who became my mentor. He was saying he could translate languages and do all these things, but it actually couldn't do any of those things. So I went up there, and it could recognize printed letters so long as they were in Courier 10, but I showed it Arial 10, and it didn't work. And he said, but don't worry. We can take the output of one perceptron and feed it as the input to another perceptron, and take the output of that, feed it to a third. And as we add more layers, it'll get smarter and smarter. And I said, well, that's interesting. Have you tried that? Well, no, but it's high on our research agenda. He died 9 years later, 1971. Things did not move as quickly then as they do now. People started to use 3 and 4 layer neural nets, so we're a little better. Then they tried 10 and 20 layer neural nets, and they didn't work at all. And there was actually a math problem. It's not really that widely recognized. You have to keep, for the mathematicians here, a convex error surface, otherwise the information disintegrates. That math problem was solved about 5 or 6 years ago by a group of mathematicians, including our colleague Jeff Hinton. And now you could go to 100 layers. So 5 or 6 years ago, the big accusation against the field is you guys can't even tell the difference between a dog and a cat. It's actually a pretty difficult problem. The essence of a dog and a cat is at level 15. So now that we can go to 20, 50, 100 layer neural nets, we could tell the difference between a dog and a cat and thousands of other categories and actually do it better than humans. Now there is one problem which you alluded to, it's a motto in the field that life begins at 1 billion examples. One of the reasons I'm at Google is we have 1 billion examples of some things, like dogs and cats. But I'm working on language. We've got a lot of language, but it's not annotated with what it means. Now, humans are able to learn from less information. Your significant other or your boss tells you something once or twice, you might actually learn from that. At least some people have been reported to do that. That's a remaining strength of human intelligence. So I've had a thesis of hierarchical models. It's a little bit different than the deep neural nets. Larry Page asked me, it's articulated in my last book, How to Create a Mind. Larry Page recruited me to do that here at Google. So we're applying it to language. We just announced recently Smart Reply. So those of you who have Gmail, if you notice these 3 suggestions on how you can reply comes from this program, which understands language, not at human levels, but well enough to give you suggestions. And that's the big, so this is, I've got one approach that we're proposing as a way to learn from less information like humans do. But that's the big challenge in the field now. But I think that's going to be overcome. The way AlphaGo did it is they trained it on 1 million examples of master games. That was enough data to create a poor to fair Go player. So they had it play itself. And there's ways to rate the moves and see what side in the simulated game won. So now they can create, many billions of examples, and that's how it
So I wonder if I could ask a question about this. Ray has written a book called How to Create a Mind, and Minsky wrote something called The Society of Mind sometime earlier. One of the interesting things about our brains is that we seem to be able to make models, to make abstractions of what we observe in the world, and then reason about those models. So the question I have for Ray is whether any of the neural network structures that you know about have any hope of doing this sort of abstraction, modeling, and reasoning.
Well, that's actually another weakness of these very big deep neural nets. They don't explain themselves very well. There's been attempts to visualize the results, and they might find, oh, here's the essence of a cat over here in level 42, but they're not really, the information is diffusely represented throughout a vast neural net. The neocortex, it's the part of our brain where we do our thinking, it's the outer layer, is not, in my opinion, not a big deep neural net. It's a hierarchy, and it's a self-organizing hierarchy of patterns. And that explains itself better because you find a coherent explanation in each level of the hierarchy. And as we go up the hierarchy, things get more interesting. So at the very bottom of the hierarchy, I can tell that's a straight line. At the top of the hierarchy, I can tell that was funny, that's ironic, she's pretty. And if you remember, 2 million years ago, we were walking around without these big foreheads. You remember that? And you look at other primates, they have a slanted brow. So we got this additional amount of neocortex. Up until recently, it was thought that was qualitatively different, but we now see it's actually wired the same. So what did we do with that additional neocortex? Well, we're already doing a very good job of being primates, so we put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. And the hierarchy now went to many more levels. And that was the enabling factor for us to invent language and art, music. Every human culture ever discovered has music. No primate culture has music. And one of my themes is we're going to do it again when we wirelessly connect our neocortex to the cloud, to synthetic neocortex. And just like 2 million years ago, we'll put it at the top of the hierarchy, so we'll be funnier, we'll be more musical, better at expressing loving sentiments. So that's in my view, the future of humanity.
Will I be softer? So not long ago, if we go to the beginning of what we'd call kind of tech in Silicon Valley, of course we could go way back and say it's Fairchild, et cetera. But I'm going to go back to the kind of late 70s and early 80s. In those days, we would have potentially listed the players, whether they're in Silicon Valley or not, but in tech of Microsoft, possibly Compaq, who came on a little bit later, IBM, obviously, with the personal computer, certainly arguably Apple at that time with the big names. Today, some people would argue we have the FANG companies, as F-A-N-G companies, as Wall Street likes to call them, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, possibly add Amazon. Maybe Microsoft is back in the game, which is pretty interesting because both Apple and Microsoft might have left the game for a while and come back to the game, which is really quite interesting. So who are the companies, or what will they do that will be the big winners of the next decade? I'm going to start with Anne, because in a little bit this is kind of your field.
Well, if we look at the most valuable companies on the planet today, we have the top 5 are all technology companies. And Amazon, Microsoft, Google /Alphabet, Facebook. And then we have a couple Chinese companies in the top 10 as well, Alibaba and Tencent.
Right.
So we look at that, and it's almost 7 of the top 10 companies, 6 some days, 7 some days, are all technology companies. Scale is benefiting the already scaled. The richness of these companies, what is on the treasury of Google right now, $92 billion. We talked about the research work that's being done at Google alone. The amount of research being done by those top 5 companies in the US is almost equal to the national research or the US research budget. So, it's, the obligation these companies have for our future is huge. The resources they have for the future and the benefits that they're going to get at scale, because it's a golden age for these companies, as it is for startups. But to be at scale right now at this point in time is really an unfair competitive advantage.
Well, Vint and I are at Google. One of the reasons I went there is for these resources. It'd be very hard. I've been working kind of my whole life on AI, and it'd be very hard to do that project now outside Google because you get spoiled with the fantastic resources. We do have billions of examples of many things, and there's a few computers laying around and lots of talent, and the opportunity to launch something and have 1 billion people use it. What I really appreciate there is actually it's a bottom-up culture, as I'm sure you've noticed. It's not like, okay, we got this project, we've got to do this and this and this, and you're going to do this. It's not like that. Like from the very bottom up, all the engineers and non-engineers decide what they're going to do with an understanding of what the mission is. Somehow that all self-organizes and works. It's a pretty remarkable way to organize projects.
You agree with that, Ben?
So, well, let me make an observation about Google in particular, but you could generalize this. If you think about the kinds of things that Google has made available to the rest of the world, we've given away software, we create infrastructure, we create platforms that other people can capitalize on, can invent with. Internet was designed to do the same thing. It was intended to be a place where new ideas could be explored and implemented. I would argue that that most of what Google tends to do is incredibly good engineering. I mean, dramatically better kinds of computing, like the new TensorFlow equipment and things like that. The engineering is unbelievable. It's just astonishing. You didn't mention Xerox PARC in your list of companies, and in the early 70s, that was a place that was doing extremely advanced stuff. They were living 20 years in the future. The reason I run around with this is to point out that some of the more fundamental investments that were made, like funding the ARPANET and the internet in the first place, were made by organizations in the government like DARPA and the Department of Energy and NSF. That basic research is not going to come out of most of industry. I mean, yes, IBM and Bell Labs were unique in some sense because they were doing Nobel Prize winning research. Most of us are doing very, very high class engineering application or applications research. We really need the governments, especially our own, to commit to funding really hard research that may not pay off for decades. And we're losing that capacity right now under the current administration. That's a really serious problem.
So if you were investing today in a company that would be the next, you don't want to say the next Google, but something of that stature out 10 years, what would it be? Vint?
I would say it's probably something to do with biology, with the ability to gather sensor data and to evaluate and analyze it. And somewhere nearby, I would be including things like bioengineering and bioelectronics.
Interesting.
I mean, just to emphasize that health and medicine, the cutting edge of it, has become an information technology. It didn't used to be. It was hit or miss. So we made linear progress. It's useful. I gave a talk to junior high school kids recently and said if it hadn't been for the progress we've made, you all would be senior citizens because life expectancy was 19 1,000 years ago, 37 in 1800. But it's now progressing exponentially because we're gathering the object code of life. We're making exponential gains in understanding it, modeling it, simulating it, and most importantly, reprogramming it. And we now have clinical applications that are coming out. It's a trickle today. It'll be a flood in 10 years. We can now fix a broken heart. Not yet from romance. That'll take some more advances in virtual reality, but from a heart attack. I'm involved with a company where we're growing organs, kidneys, lungs, and hearts, installing them successfully with the patient's DNA in animals. This is coming to a human near you. This will be a flood in 10 years, and it's going to transform health and medicine and agriculture. We're really being able to master the information processes underlying life.
Could I ask Ann a question
Yes.
about this? We all understand that our biggest expenses in the United States are healthcare and social services, Social Security and things like that. And we know that the growth rate of those costs are outpacing our ability to generate tax revenues. So the question for Ann is whether or not an effort to improve people's health, that is to do preventative medicine, as opposed to fixing people after they're sick or broken, is the way to reduce that cost. And there must be some knowledge that we need about ourselves to achieve that objective. So does it look to you like that's a space where companies could actually be successful?
Well, certainly, we do see a lot of pitches on, preventative health care. We've seen them in many forms. We've seen them in wearable devices. Certainly some of them have had some success, others. We've seen them in applications in the medical field as a whole. We've seen them in applications even through, next fintech companies in the insurance space. There's not really, in my mind, there's not a central theme there that galvanizes that to be a large enough business. Even when you look at some of the early entries like Fitbit, it's been a great investment for the investors, but it's not achieving quite the scale because it's a single entity. So it's the same, we're at the same stage where we are with AI, where we can apply it in little silos, which may make reasonable companies, but there's not a grand theme here right now, I think, until...
Preventive medicine is important, but this escalating cost of healthcare, in my opinion, is going to reverse over a 20-year period as we get to the mature phase of biotechnology and then medical nanorobots in the 2030s and so on. The practice of medicine today is still the old technology. 98% of the interventions are still pre-information era.
In other words, standard of care, which is, it seems to work for everybody else. Maybe it'll work for you as opposed to doing something more analytic.
It's going to transform. 10 years from now, it's going to be quite different. 20 years from now, it's going to be revolutionarily different. We'll ultimately have interventions that deal with most disease that will be distributed like vaccines. The dynamic we're seeing, I think, will gradually reverse.
Yeah, I think what you're hearing here is that we've got a 10-year horizon and a 20-year horizon on virtually everything, at least that's what you're saying, Ray, is this digital transformation across materials science, bioscience, agribusiness, every industry that you can think of, we can see it. We can see it penetrating, and that's the next 10 years is it's sort of the cards start turning over. You get past that decade, and really then industries are transformed. I mean, you don't have just Tesla, you know, and General Motors and a huge gap. You have that in almost every industry, because we're early in everything. You think how young even Google is as a company, or how young, you know, only in those companies that we talked about that are the most valuable on the planet, there's only one oldster, that's Microsoft. It's 42 years old. Yeah. But everybody else is a decade or so old in their commercial release of products. So we're really, really young as an industry, but we're moving really fast. I mean, one thing that Vint talked about recently was software development itself, that remains one of our unsolved problems, that we're developing so much software on this planet right now, but it's kind of buggy stuff.
Oh.
And it's manual. It's very manual. You know, separately, we talk about this. You know, the semiconductor industry about 20 years ago had to automate around something called VHDL. Most of you know what that is, because the semiconductor chips got so large it became impractical for humans to actually lay out gate by gate by gate. It was just impractical to do it when you've got billions of transistors. So they developed a language to describe what the chip would do, and then software actually creates most of the chip. We don't do that in software yet, although it should be dawning on us that given the cost of software engineers and the bugginess of software and the complexity of software, the size of software and the number, that there are opportunities to begin to automate that as well.
I don't know. I get worried about, you know, what we might end up doing is automating the production of bugs. You know, we're already good enough at it, and we don't need help with that.
We're not talking about flies and fleas. You mean software bugs?
Yeah, right. Yes.
Yeah, that is true.
I mean, what's really embarrassing is that we've been programming computers for like 70 or 80 years now, and we've never figured out how to make programs that don't have serious bugs in them, that are often exploitable, and it gets worse now that we've networked them, right? Because now the exploiter can be anywhere in the world. So I think we need better programming environments. I want a little program that sits on your shoulder and is looking at what you're programming, and it says, you just generated a buffer overflow. What do you mean? And it says, well, look at line number 23. You know? I mean, we need that kind of environment that can help us detect when we've made a stupid mistake. And I like the idea of automating things, but I worry that the depth of knowledge that's required to make sure that the automated thing doesn't generate the same kinds of dumbass bugs that we do as human beings is a big problem.
I mean, the reality is the production of software has been automated. And, it's possible now to create very complex systems in a matter of days. It used to take years. So there's layers of systems that assist you creating complex software architectures.
You know, there's a story recently, of course, some people here from Microsoft, I think. Microsoft deployed a bot on Twitter which seemed like a good idea, and it was learning from other people's responses, and it learned from enough people's responses that it started swearing, and they had to take it offline. So in fact, your point of we will learn how to create bugs is absolutely true, because the database that we have to learn from is ridden with bugs as it is ridden with swear words, apparently. So you didn't answer one question, Ann. If you were writing a $5 or $10 million check today from your firm, what does that company look like that you'd write that check to that's going to be a big company in 5 or 10 years?
Well, we focus just on software, so our focus is bigger and bigger almost every day. I mean, it's hard to focus. There's just so much opportunity. I would really like to see a company that, you know, clearly software development has changed pretty radically. I'm on the board of a company called Sonatype. They operate what's called the central repository, where if you're a software programmer today, you download components from these open source repositories. Right. In 2016, from that repository, there were almost 70 billion components downloaded. So in 2 years ago, it was only 15 billion. So the velocity has changed, but I would really like to see a company that fundamentally changes not just the velocity, but the quality of software that we develop. And I have not seen that, although I keep investing in companies that do well, that keep making big incremental improvements in software creation. Because fundamentally, when we're talking about digital transformation, we're talking about software.
Yep.
So there's a nice modularity to what Ann is suggesting. On the other hand, anybody here who's ever had to maintain libraries knows that they become flimsy over a period of time.
That's why I quit my job at the Federal Reserve Bank.
There we go, okay. So one of the things that we would have to think our way through is how to make sure that those libraries are properly maintained. I don't know whether you can automate that or not, but it's pretty important. Also, figuring out what they do, being able to express in some semantically useful way what this library does so that the automated programming system gets the right pieces to put them together.
And so they're even recognizable over time.
Yeah.
But part of the art of entrepreneurship is really isn't possible to predict. I mean, I'd written about the emergence of search engines in the late 90s, in the 80s, but there were 50 projects to do that. And the fact that it'd be these couple of kids in a Stanford dorm would take over the world of search, that was very hard to anticipate. And so I don't think there's any magic to it. I think we need brilliant venture capitalists like Ann who can see the right spark of judgment and brilliance and courage of people that will succeed, but I don't think there's an easy formula to it.
Well,
Yeah,
and
I totally
you know,
agree.
those two guys at Stanford were something like the 50th search engine, you know, on the planet to be around. It happened to be the right model, the right time, the right, you know, whole bunch. Same with Facebook. It wasn't the first kind of version of that. Of course, there was MySpace and several others, but it was the one that somehow hit at the right time, the right place. It's incredibly hard to guess what that would be, and you've guessed a lot of them right.
Well, I mean, that's why we're called venture capitalists. You know, I've always hoped that by the time I retire, I could just be called a capitalist.
Okay, 2 lightning round questions here. The first one is, and we'll start with you, Ray. If you would have done anything different over the last 30 or 40 years in tech, what would it have been?
Interesting. I would have started timing my projects with some coherent methodology earlier, because timing is critical. And you know, all of these projects, search engines, social networks, there were projects 20 years earlier. I remember them. You really have to be in the right place at the right time. And I would have tried to practice that earlier.
Wonderful. Ann?
I ran my software company in Minneapolis for 6 years before I moved to California in 1984. And in hindsight, I should have moved here earlier.
Interesting. Invent.
Well, if I could have gotten away with it, I would have started with IPv6 instead of IPv4 because this transition is so damn painful.
That's true. Well, okay, and last lightning round question for tonight. I'm going to start with you, Vint, to put you on the spot. So, looking forward 50 years to 2067, can you describe our surroundings, our lives, and our technology in the year 2067 to the best of your ability?
I would borrow the term ubiquitous computing. Who was the guy at Xerox that did that? Mark Weiser. Mark Weiser is the one who passed away too early. But his idea was that the networks and the computers would just sort of fade into the woodwork and the walls and everything else. I think that we will be in an environment where we are online all the time. The buildings have ears and eyes. They participate in our lives in a much more subtle way than they do today, where it's kind of explicit when you get your mobile out and you talk to Google or what have you. So I think that's the one likely parameter here, is that we are fully networked It's like and your expectations are just like plugging into the wall to get electricity. You assume that everything is online, everything is programmable, everything is interactive, and there's significant intelligence in the dialogue that you can maintain with that environment.
And it's 2067. Take us there.
Gosh, it's, I agree with what Vint is saying. I think it'll be, if people that are around from anywhere near this era, we'll have to explain that we had to restart everything quite frequently to make it work. My iPhone didn't send email, so I have to restart it. My Windows computer has to apply patches. It just seems ridiculous. So this idea of seamlessness is a beautiful thing. For us here today, it still seems pretty seamed. So the idea that technology is more virtuous and just around us than we're so involved with us would be quite magical.
Well, I guess, before Ray tries to answer this question, just point out that 50 years ago was 1967. And you might ask yourself, what was happening in 1967? Could we have projected anything like what we have today? And, Ray might have been able to do that, but not very many other people.
Well, before I ask Ray this, just one point for tonight. Notice in the middle of the awards tonight, in the middle of Silicon Valley, with some amazing technologists in the audience, we couldn't put a picture on this wall for about 10 minutes. And it's just PowerPoint and a projector. One would think we could have solved this. And so I do wonder if in 50 years we won't have to restart the building to breathe or whatever it is. All right, with that, Ray, our true futurist here, what are your thoughts when we look at 2067? Bring us to that day.
Okay, so I wrote a book about this.
Yeah, right, that's right.
Please go on by it. And the name of it is again?
But it was about 2045, not 2067. It's called The Singularity is Near. So I alluded to some of what I anticipate. We will be extending our neocortex in the cloud. We have brain extenders already. Our brain is not directly connected to the cloud. We go through these devices, but they are brain extenders. The fact that they're not really in our bodies and brains, I think, is an arbitrary distinction. It'd be a good place to put it. You wouldn't lose it that way. If you remember that extension we got to the neocortex 2 million years ago, that was a one-shot deal because if our skulls kept expanding, birth would have become impossible. It was just enough, though, to put us over that threshold where we could invent language and technology and the internet. So we're going to do it again, but this won't be a one-shot deal because the cloud is pure information technology. It's doubling in power every year as we speak. That will continue to do that. So I'm walking along and I say, oh, there's Vint and Ann. They're coming my way. I better think of something clever to say. I've got 2 seconds. My 300 million neocortical modules isn't going to cut it. I need 1 billion for 2 seconds. Just the way this computer can multiply itself 1 millionfold in the cloud, we'll do that with our brains and think of something clever to say in 2 seconds. Thinking then will be a hybrid of biological and non-biological thinking. But the non-biological part will be subject to the law of accelerated trends. It will grow exponentially. And in my view, people talk about the AIs versus the humans. We create technologies as extensions of ourselves. It is part of humanity. We couldn't reach fruit at that higher branch 1,000 years ago, so we created a tool that extended our reach. Who here could build this building? We create machines that leverage our muscles. We can now access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. We will make ourselves smarter and funnier and so on, and create creations that we can't even imagine today. We'll be spending a lot of time in highly realistic virtual and augmented reality. So people say, well, you talk about radical life extension. It's going to get boring to live hundreds of years and doing the same things over and over again. And I agree. If we had radical life extension without radical life expansion, we would get profoundly bored. Ennui is a good French word for that. But we're going to be expanding our minds and the kinds of intellectual creations and artistic creations and relational experiences we can have, the fantastic virtual reality, augmented reality experiences that we'll invent, so we won't get bored.
Well, with that, thank you so much for continuing to inspire us all. We have a great round of applause for this amazing panel. Thank you so much.